Okay.
Is it recording right now?
No. Oh,
It does.
yes it is. Oh wait, I wasn't ready.
First, I must say, you would not know what went into the production of this video. Secondly, we are taking men's shirts and we are making peasant blouses. And how we're going to do that is, I've chosen a large men's shirt because I want it to be very generous. And we're going to cut a line, we're going to lay it flat like this without the hanger, and we're going to cut a line right here. Then we are going to stitch shut the placket, and we are going to add bias tape to that. The bias tape will be stitched right side of bias tape to right side of shirt. We'll flip it around to the inside, and that'll be the casing for the neck elastic. On the sleeves, you'll note that there's a placket back here behind the cuff. We're going to cut the sleeve off right above that placket on both sides, and we're going to do a simple machine rolled hem, similar to what you would find on blue jeans. Actually similar to what's on the bottom of this, only not quite so narrow. Then we're going to turn this shirt inside out, and we'll put a strip of flat bias tape around, leave an opening, and put elastic in, whatever their arm measurement is. And that will create, that'll be about 4 inches up, and that'll create a nice little ruffle along the bottom, and then all the sleeves will look uniform. So let me show you how to do that. Okay, so I'm getting ready to mark the line that I'm going to cut the yoke off, and really this is kind of something that doesn't really matter. I mean, you don't want to cut too big of a hole because then the shirt might not fit properly. We can always add more elastic to get it to gather closer to the neck so that it's not off the shoulder, but if we get it to gather up too much, it might look funny. So I'm going to err on the conservative side, and I'm going to go ahead and make my line a little bit closer to the collar. Once you open it up, it ends up being a really huge area, so I don't think we have to worry about it not being able to gather up too much. Okay, I'm going to leave that connected there. I'm going to actually sew that together. Then over here on the sleeve, like I mentioned, we want to cut right above where that placket comes because we're going to hem that. So we're going to cut as close to that placket as we can on each side. And let me get these cut away, and you can see what it looks like after it's been cut. So it's already kind of starting to take on the shape of a peasant blouse. We just need our elastic. So I've got some bias tape here, and this is actually some double fold quilting bias tape, and I've trimmed it down to the width that I want. If you just buy regular, like inch wide bias tape, you would be good. And I'm going to press it open. Bias tape is cut on the bias, hence the name, and it doesn't ravel. So you can actually sew it onto something without having to turn the edges under, and it'll never ravel. You don't have to worry about it. If you want to turn the edges under, you can, but you don't have to. I'm going to press this open because I have found that rather than fighting with the fabric at the sewing machine, a lot of times if you press whatever you're working on where you want it first, you'll have less problems at the sewing machine. Ready when you are. So now I am going to sew across this placket here with the buttons buttoned because that's how the shirt's going to end up. And to do that, I'm going to take the extension table off the machine so that I have plenty of room to work. I've already made my bobbin. And that doesn't match up exactly, but that's okay. I'm just going to stitch a stitch across there. And one thing I always like to do is trim threads right when I'm finished. That way I don't have to go back and do them later. All right, so I've got my bias tape that I've opened. And I don't really want to have that opening right in front there. I'm going to probably choose like in the back here because that's not going to be as noticeable. But I'll just start on the shoulder. And I'm going to leave a little bit, I guess it doesn't really matter. I'm just going to put these two together, and you can find, you might want to pin this together first. I'm just going to put the two pieces together. And I'm going to use the presser foot as my guide. I'm going to put the raw edges of the fabric in the bias. And you don't want to stretch too much here, although if you do, it won't really matter because if the fabric gets a little stretched out, because you're putting elastic in it anyway. So I'm going to stitch, do a couple stitches back, and then we're going to just go forward and we're going to stitch this all the way around. And I'm just matching up those raw edges. Like I said, you can pin it first if you're more comfortable with pinning. Sometimes if my fabric is pretty cooperative, I won't use pins. But if I have like a really silky fabric or something, then I'll use more pins. And I'm just stopping every so often, and I'm actually got a bad habit here. You should stop with the needle in the end position, that way as you readjust stuff, your stitching doesn't go everywhere. And we're coming right back to where we started. And we're just, oh, actually we're not, we're coming to the front. While I'm doing this, I am constantly readjusting here, but I also hold my hand in a way that I can kind of feel what's going on underneath the fabric so that I don't end up with puckers or anything that might need to be taken out later. And because this is stretched a little from being cut, I am barely got enough bias tape here. So, note to self, you might want to cut it a little bit longer because we could have very easily had to patch that. Okay, now we will go trim our threads and we'll head over to the iron where we will press this. Okay, so now we're at the ironing board and I've just put the neckline over the edge of the ironing board the way that I had it stitched. I'm just going to take that bias tape and flip it over the stitched seam, and the first thing I'm going to do is press that edge over. And with this kind of fabric being a cotton, if you use a lot of steam, you get a nice crisp pressing in. And it doesn't matter if your bias tape gets a little bit puckered. Bias tape's pretty flexible since it's cut on the bias of the fabric, so you don't usually get too many puckers. You can also use twill tape if you have some. I know Jillian Hannell had a huge roll of that, and she said that's what she was using when she did one of these. But since I have to go out and buy something, I prefer to use the bias tape because I know it's flexible since it's cut on the bias. Once we get this all pressed up like that, then we're going to flip it inside out, because now the rest of the project we're going to be working from the inside out. So we press that over. We're now going to press it down so that we're pressing right where that seam is. We're going to press that so that it's either a little bit on the inside or just right on the seam. Whatever works for you. If you think that you don't want it to show, like flip up on the other side, then you can press it a little to one side. If this was something I was making that wasn't costuming, because you can get away with a lot with costuming, I would probably do an additional row of stitching before I even press this back, just to kind of hold it in place. But you really, if you get a good pressing in, you really can skip that step and not have to do that. We're going to leave this part here open where it met, because that's where we're going to insert our elastic. And I'm going to use a 1/4 inch elastic. I've seen some other videos and patterns where they call for 1/2 inch, but I think 1/4 is going to work just fine. So I'm just going around, and as you can see, as you turn it under, you're actually going from a smaller curve to a larger curve, and that's also where the bias tape comes in handy, because the bias tape, this outer edge will stretch a little. Whereas if you just took regular fabric that was cut on grain, you wouldn't be able to get it to be flexible like that. And I will probably go ahead and pin this all down before I sew it, just because of that very reason. I don't want puckers. Okay, so now as you see, we are working from the wrong side of the garment, and we've got our bias tape pinned down all the way around. Looks like I've missed a spot here. I pin about every 3 inches or so, and I like to use these long pins. I usually wait for a sale and get a big box of them half price. I usually like to leave the head sticking out more than the point, because that way, as you're sewing and the fabric's coming around, you're not stabbing yourself. But I really like using the bigger pins. Okay, so with the machine in the same position, we're gonna go back to where our overlap of bias tape is on the shoulder. And at this point in time, I'm just gonna leave that opening there because we're gonna use that to put our elastic in. And on this, I'm going to actually put my folded edge against the 5/8 inch line, which you can hardly see it, but there's a little black line on the machine here that has that marked. And our elastic is only 1/4 of an inch wide, but by stitching 5/8 of an inch away, we've left a generous opening there. And when I'm stitching this, I'm not really necessarily watching where the needle's going in. I'm watching the side, kind of watching all of it, but I'm making sure that this folded edge stays on that 5/8. And I'm kind of using, like I tell the kids, I'm using my hands kind of like little pinchers, and I'm holding the fabric and I'm kind of manipulating the fabric as I go along to keep everything nice and flat. With this particular garment though, if we did end up with a few puckers, it won't matter because we're putting elastic in, and that will just kind of blend in once the elastic draws up the neckline. And depending on whether you want to do this off the shoulder or not is how much elastic you put in. So the rule of thumb when putting in the elastic is to go ahead, don't cut it first, just go ahead and take your whole long piece of, like 1 yard piece of elastic, stick it in there, and then try it on the person who's going to be wearing it to make sure that you adjust those gathers and that elastic to make the neckline as deep as you want it. And we're coming around to where we began. We can just go ahead and stitch right up to that and back stitch. And then once again, I always like to trim my threads, both the beginning and finishing stitching at the same time, then I have to go back. Okay, so now I've got this piece of elastic. It's really a lot longer than what we need. I'm going to fold it, and I'm going to put a pin in there, and I'm using this to string it through. Now, if I had a shorter piece and I was worried about this getting lost in the casing, I would actually pin this piece against the fabric so that I don't pull all the way through. But this is such a long piece, I'm not really worried about that. So we're gonna find this opening, and we're going to just slide the pin in. And what I do here is I'm pushing the base of the pin with one hand, the thumb of one hand, while I take the other hand and I load the pin and I use my finger to hold the fabric on. When I get as much as I can on there, I will hold it, let go with this hand and hold the front of the pin with this hand and pull this fabric through. And then it's just a matter of repeating that. And this works well for like drawstrings. If you have a drawstring that comes out on a pair of shorts or whatever you're doing, the same technique can be used. Okay, so now I've got the elastic all the way through and I've come to the opening here, and I'm just gonna work it through and pull it out. And at this point, I'm just going to pin it, and I'm gonna wait until I get with my model to try it on her to see how I want to adjust the neckline. So I'm just going to pin it for now. Taking a break from the neckline, we've just pinned our elastic, and we're going to leave that until we try it on our model. And while we're waiting to do that, because our model's not available right now, we're going to finish this bottom edge. So the shirt is inside out, and like I mentioned earlier, a lot of times if you press something first, you can get your fabric to behave much better at the sewing machine and have a much nicer experience. Since we have such a small edge here, I'm going to get one little edge started. I'm just basically pressing this under 1/4 of an inch, and I'm eyeballing it. If you need to measure, you can. And I'm getting that started because I want to, it looks like I'm going to have to do it all one by one. I thought I was going to be able to do both layers. I'm pressing it under first to just give me a nice little fold along here, and then I'm going to press it under again. And this is part of a method referred to as a machine rolled hem. A lot of times you'll see this type of hem on the bottom of blue jeans. I use it on almost everything nowadays. I do very few hand-stitched hems. You'll even see it on really nice gowns. They just have nice little feet that make it look really narrow and cute. Ours is going to be about 1/4 of an inch because if we make it any narrower, it's harder to do. And we're just trying to do a simple hijacking of this men's shirt, so we don't need to make it any more complicated.